Welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, June 7th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about polling and the 2024 presidential election and how after Donald Trump's guilty verdict, it seems to show that there is, in fact, a shift amongst the American public now knowing that Donald Trump is a convicted felon. And the lead here for Donald Trump has evidently shrunk across the United States in a number of key and crucial battleground states alongside on the national average, and while it still ultimately shows him with a very, very narrow advantage over President Biden, in most cases just a percentage point, it shows that there are in fact voters that were swayed by this decision from the court to find Donald Trump guilty. Now, Donald Trump, for a very long period of time, has been long advocating that if he was found guilty, this would in fact boost his electoral performance. And while it certainly did increase the amount of cash on hand that he had, the fundraising that he did in the month of May, it didn't necessarily increase the amount of support he received nationwide. And that is ultimately Donald Trump's problem. You can win an election that is based on support, and you can win an election that is based on just general disenchantment with the election altogether. What we saw in 2016 was that ultimately favored Donald Trump, when voters cared a little bit more in 2020, the highest voter turnout we've seen since 1900. You're talking a very, very long period of time, 120 years that we had seen voter turnout that high, that President Biden ultimately came out ahead. And so what I think this time around, the Democratic Party is really trying to bring up the stakes for 2024, mentioning Project 2025, Donald Trump as a candidate for president, yada, yada, yada. The Trump team is more focused on maintaining the status quo and maintaining the lead that they have right now. But that becomes a little bit more difficult when Donald Trump is found guilty by a jury of his peers. What we knew going into this verdict was that should he be found innocent, or there was even a hung jury, that it would be a lot more beneficial to Donald Trump because he could ultimately play that off as a lot better than being found guilty. While it certainly might resonate more with his base that he was found guilty and that it was ultimately a decision from Democrats and, all leaning into this idea that everyone is out to get Donald Trump except for Donald Trump himself, it's something that Donald Trump has done well amongst Republicans, but not necessarily amongst the average American. And we can see that in terms of the public's response to the guilty verdict. It says here that ultimately, the majority of voters across the country do in fact believe that Donald Trump is guilty, that Donald Trump did commit the crimes that he was accused of and found guilty for and became a convicted felon for. Now, does that necessarily matter to them more than issues like the economy or healthcare or the southern border? Not necessarily, according to some polls, but at the same time, a lot more voters are less likely to back Donald Trump in the event that this is something that is maintained, that this convicted felon status, which, spoiler alert, is going to maintain itself through the election, is going to be an issue for them and could be swayed away from voting for Donald Trump in the event that this is something that becomes more of a landing point for the average voter. And so what we actually found was that in a polling do-over here, essentially what we found was that the New York Times went back to the same constituents, the same people that they had canvassed before, 2,000 voters, and said, you know what, here's what you said before you decided, you found out about the verdict. Now that you know about the verdict, who do you end up supporting for president? And we found here that Donald Trump's lead narrowed down from 3 points down to 1, and some more important shifts amongst different demographic groups, but ultimately, we found that Donald Trump did in fact lose support, with neither candidate reaching 50%. Now, at face value, the Trump campaign might look at this and say, a 2% decrease is negligible. But in reality, it really isn't. When you take a look at the 2020 presidential election, 56 electoral votes were decided in a state by less than 2%. In fact, actually, it's 72. North Carolina should have been characterized by map here messed up, but that actually fuels my point even further. You have 72 electoral votes here when every single vote counts, and Joe Biden won by less than 72 electoral votes in the 2020 election. 270 are needed to win, and Joe Biden only received 306, which means that in these key states here, a 2% shift in the event President Biden sees an increase in some battleground states, or all of a sudden stumbles across yet another scandal for Donald Trump, an additional 2% shift, even a 1% shift in some of these states, could make or break the election for Donald Trump. And right now his lead, although on the national level, is still in the advantage, it's not high enough that he can afford to lose really any core base of his support. And it seems to show that this guilty verdict actually has done that. Now, when I take a look at these battleground states, I do want to say that right now, even with the guilty verdict, I don't expect Donald Trump to lose many of these states. I think he ultimately still comes out ahead in the states like North Carolina and Georgia and arguably even Wisconsin. But when it comes down to a state like Pennsylvania, I do think Joe Biden would end up negligibly winning by a margin of less than 1 point or roughly 1 to 2 points. anywhere within a very close and competitive race, I do think Joe Biden has the upper hand. Combined with other factors that could really be compounding factors for the Biden campaign in their benefit. For example, the Arizona abortion referendum that's set to hit the ballot this coming November in Arizona, which abortion will become a more mainstream issue in the state and a more prominent one that voters will be turning out for, maybe not necessarily for the presidential, but more for the abortion referendum, and as a result, end up voting for Joe Biden down or up the ballot. And so when you look at the 2020 presidential and the amount of states that were this competitive, you can't help but realize too, that Donald Trump might be in the advantage point at this time, and a 2% shift could have him lose the election. But at the same time, a lot of this is just simply about turning out your base and winning over those independent voters that don't even comprise that much of the electorate that we might think. These core states are the most important ones. I mean, this is amongst the 7 that we routinely talk about. Throw in Michigan and Nevada, and you have a complete map here. And they were decided by very narrow margins in the last election. And so right now, I think what Democrats and Republicans are hoping for is that Democrats are able to turn out their base, Republicans are able to turn out their base, and arguably, I think that this guilty verdict has actually inspired both sides of the aisle to turn out. And so now that independents are swaying over, and again, they're not the majority of the state, even though we might see some numbers that show plurality of voters are independents or registering independent nationwide, what we know is that the average American is far more partisan than what they would like to let on. The average independent is far more partisan than what they would like to let on. And so what we know about that means that roughly 80% of this electorate is already polarized to a point where they're going to vote for Biden, they're going to vote for Trump. This guilty verdict seems to have inspired both bases to turn out and vote. But when independent voters shift, as they are away from Donald Trump, that's where you start to see the benefit for President Biden. And I'm not trying to play this up as some type of major, all of a sudden Trump is losing the election. I never thought that this was going to completely rework the election, except for maybe in the earlier stances of this consideration about the court cases, and even then, it was never really about the hush money case. It was more about Georgia and January 6th, both of which we now know are likely not going to be brought up before the election. And so again, the impact on the election is going to be nothing, right? And so now that we see that this hush money case, which voters do in fact see as the least significant out of the 4 total cases here, the least significant, if there is a way that Democrats do end up finding a way to, take those other court cases and hammer Donald Trump on them, make him look guilty of the other things that he is currently under investigation for, you could in fact see additional movement on the issues of conviction, on the issues of, whether or not Donald Trump is guilty of crimes that he's being accused of, all of those different things here. And so while I do think there is in fact a shift, I'm not here to argue that this is all of a sudden completely changing the trajectory of the election. But I do believe that should Donald Trump narrowly lose this election, the guilty verdict will play a major, major role in that. And when I look specifically at these 5 battleground states that were all decided again by less than 2 points in the 2020 presidential election, 0.6 in Wisconsin, 1.2 in Pennsylvania, 1.3 in North Carolina, 0.2 in Georgia, 0.3 in Arizona. These states were very, very close. And Biden also needs a lot of support, residual support, in order to win this race. And if he's able to just shift the state even more slightly in favor of the Democratic Party, it bodes good news for the Democratic ticket because it means they win re-election. Donald Trump needs to win a significant number of battleground states in order to win the presidential. What we know is that when you take even just the safe Republican states, the likely Republican states, and you group them all in, I can show you right here, the math still isn't that favorable to the GOP as you otherwise might think. You throw in Nebraska, you throw in Maine, and here we are with the states that are routinely Republican and probably are going to go to the GOP. Even if you throw over North Carolina and throw over Georgia and throw over Arizona, in some cases, it just simply isn't enough. Even if you throw over Nevada, which surprisingly enough has the largest margin here for Donald Trump out of any of these battleground states, Donald Trump still comes up short. Joe Biden would need to just win the Hillary Clinton states from 2016 with the exception of Nevada, meaning that he would underperform her in a state like Nevada, and would win Nebraska second, which he won by a margin of roughly 7 points in the last race. And we can see here that if he is able to win Minnesota and win Michigan, Pennsylvania, that puts Joe Biden, and Wisconsin, sorry, I forgot that it wasn't characterized, that puts Joe Biden at 270 electoral votes. And so when you see these very minimal shifts, those margins make all the difference in elections like this one. It makes complete states go from red to blue, from blue to red, and sets mandates, electoral mandates that were set by President Biden back in 2020 when he won the election with 306 electoral votes. To also put things into perspective about how close the last election was and why every single vote matters, every single scandal, every single news hit, all of these different things here that are impactful for President Trump and President Biden. make all the difference in these battleground states. Wisconsin was 0.6, Georgia was 0.2, and Arizona was 0.3. What you would find is if you shifted the entire nation by just 1 percentage point, Donald Trump would be president today. And that's because the electoral map here and the math would have benefited Donald Trump enough that it would have taken down Joe Biden's lead. You take away 10 electoral votes from Joe Biden, where does that put you? At 296. You take away 16, where does that put you? At 280. You take away 11, that brings you down to 269. Given the Republican advantage in the House, Republicans would have had, they don't need the majority. It's a very interesting pathway here, but essentially it's the majority of representatives from each state all having one total vote there. Republicans would have had it. And it would have been the most insane election that we would have been used to, nothing that we've ever seen before. It would have completely changed politics and the way that we look at elections for generations to come. But fortunately for President Biden, it didn't happen, and obviously unfortunately for President Trump. But just putting things into perspective, we were less than 1% away in shifts from this election being a bigger crap show than what it already was. And so to understand that, and to know that going into this election, when we see these things, where you find that even just 2% of the national electorate does in fact change their minds on who they're voting for based on this guilty verdict, we know that the guilty verdict did something for Democrats. That the guilty verdict wasn't just this non-issue, that sure might have fundraised for Donald Trump, but in no way backfired when it came down to polling data. The polls are clear. Donald Trump still has the advantage in some battleground states. Now, a question of whether or not the polls are accurate is an entirely different story. They don't seem to match a lot of what we see, and arguably, some of the polls are a lot less convincing than others. Fox News recently today, or yesterday, released a slate of polls that showed Joe Biden down 4 points in Florida and down 5 in Arizona and Nevada. When I have to look at that, I laugh. In no reality is Donald Trump losing more support out of Florida because of this verdict than he is in Nevada and Arizona. In no reality is President Biden going to do better in Florida than he would in Arizona or Nevada. To see some of those numbers really makes me question, are these polls accurate? I think while they do show, certainly, some more accuracy on the national level, 2022 has made me a bit more jaded than I think a lot more people are when they take a look at some of these polls, because they showed that Republicans were going to demolish Democrats in the House, in the Senate, in the governor elections, and yet they all came up short. But what was consistent and very, very accurate was the national average. The national average that showed that Republicans were going to win the popular vote by 2.5%, and they won by 2.8%. It was very, very accurate, and yet did not necessarily translate to Republicans winning down the ballot. Because even though Republicans were winning nationally, Democrats still won Pennsylvania, they still won Georgia, they still won Arizona, and they still won Nevada. Which means a similar thing could happen again in 2024. I do believe that they do provide metrics in some regard. That constituents that are saying we want Trump +3 shifting to Trump +1 after the verdict does mean something. Does it mean that I agree that the nation is Trump +1? Not necessarily. But the fact is that the same voters, the same group of people that you went to before who chose Trump by a larger margin, are now choosing him by a lesser margin. And whether or not that he's actually ahead or not, because I do think, again, there is certainly some validity to believing that he is ahead in the national popular vote, but could lose the general election through the Electoral College. It would be a complete 180 from what happened in 2016. But the point being here, that Republicans could be winning nationally. What I am more interested in is that shift. Those numbers that we're not just seeing from the New York Times and Siena College, but we're also seeing even from some polls like the Fox News poll that shows Joe Biden losing, but some advantages from where he was in the past. Other polls, too, that now show Joe Biden ahead, that Midwestern slate of polls that we covered just recently that show him ahead in Wisconsin, show him ahead in Michigan, but losing in Pennsylvania. A big difference from a poll done just a week ago prior to the verdict, or at least a week prior to the verdict, where Joe Biden was losing all three. The margins here are what matters, because these states are so exceptionally close. 76 electoral votes decided by less than 2% in the 2020 presidential election. That matters. 72 electoral votes that could make or break a presidential race here for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And right now, the shifts that we're seeing nationwide and the shifts we're seeing in battleground states are not benefiting Donald Trump in the way that his campaign team thought a guilty verdict might. I'm not entirely sure where that level of thinking came from or why that might be. And although it may benefit him on regards to finances and fundraising and turning out your core base, it has equally done the same for Democrats. And I'm interested to see what happens next over the next coming months and what happens with the sentencing that is set to take place very, very soon. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.